Isquis Chichewasket, Pamela Barnes. It's my honor today to formally welcome you to the Syilx territory. And so before I do that, I want to share with you a little bit about what our lands mean to us. In this part of Turtle Island, which is how we refer to North America, the sharing of our lands with peoples from other places is fairly recent. It's about 200 years. Where other parts of Turtle Island, that history goes back 500 years, 1,000 years, depending on where you're speaking of. But here it's fairly recent. And with those coming together of different peoples from different places, came some new ideas about human relationship to the land, and that are very different from our traditional viewpoint about our relationship to the lands. And so one of those concepts is the idea of ownership, human ownership of land. And we as Syilx people see ourselves more of borrowing these lands from our great grandchildren. We look at things in 7 generations. And there's a very big difference between those two ideas. So if I own this necklace, I can sell it, I can trade it, I can give it away. It's mine, I can do what I want. It's up to me how I choose to care for it. I can take great care, or I can toss it aside. Again, it's mine. I can do what I want with it. If I borrow this necklace, everything changes in those relationships. I cannot sell it. I cannot trade it. I cannot give it away. And there's an expectation that I take the very best care possible. And when I leave it or return it, that at least it's in the same condition I found it in, and if at all possible, in better. So those ideas are very different. And it's with that understanding of our relationship to these lands that we first welcomed people to the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx people. And so it's with that understanding that today I welcome you to the traditional unceded and currently occupied territory of the Syilx people, with the gentle reminder that none of us, including ourselves as Syilx people, are taking the very best care possible of these lands for all of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Linda.
Okay, well, I'll start with my introduction so I don't waste too much time, because we're here to listen to Briar, not Victoria. All right, well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Victoria Verge, and I'm welcoming you today as an uninvited guest on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. As the Education Coordinator of Adult Programming here at the Kelowna Art Gallery, and on behalf of the Board of Directors and staff, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we operate, gather, and benefit every day on the land of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Now tonight, we are joined by the one and only Briar Craig, the artist behind our current exhibition, README, which is on display at the Kelowna Art Gallery until April 17th. Briar is a professor of printmaking, photography, and drawing at UBC Okanagan. He received his BFA from Queen's University and his MFA from the University of Alberta. His work has been exhibited in over 25 solo exhibitions and hundreds of group exhibitions. Craig's art is held in the permanent collections of many notable institutions across the globe, including here at our gallery here in town. In 2009, Craig initiated the Okanagan Print Triennial in conjunction with the Vernon Public Art Gallery and the Kelowna Art Gallery. And since 2015, the OPT has been fully international. A little bit about Briar before I hand it over to him. A couple of housekeeping rules. Please be sure to save your questions until closer to the end of this evening's talk. If you have any, you can just pop them into the chat bar and I will read them aloud and we'll try and get some answers for you. One other thing I need to mention is that tonight's talk is being recorded. So if anybody wants to check it out, it will be available on our website later, hopefully tomorrow, but later next week, more likely. All right, so that's everything from me, everybody. Briar, please take it away.
Great, well, thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for the land acknowledgement, because I always feel like I fumble my way through it. And it's so important to be aware of the privilege that we all have being in this amazing place. And especially with the things that are going on in Europe right now, I think acknowledging who rightfully owns things and places that belong to them is a super important thing to do. I'm going to share my screen now because no one really wants to look at my mug. Hopefully we'll like looking at the things that I have to show you. As I said in one of my Facebook things, I will try to make this as lively and entertaining as possible. I get very nervous giving talks, so I probably will just chatter and I'd probably make weird jokes. So if you don't get anything, just ask me at the end. So Briar Craig printmaker, woohoo! But really, I'm a screen printer. How to get rid of the printmaking part? Screen printing. I'm just going to show you, this is the screen printing studio. This is where I work. This is the Universities of UBC Okanagan's screen printing room. Those are screen printing tables and drying racks for prints. This is also where I work. So I work alongside the students and try to get as much work as humanly possible done in the summer months when they're not around. But it's a fantastic place to work, and it's very much about a community, which is really nice because I think it's always about learning from other people. And even as they're learning and as I'm trying to teach them things, they're teaching me just as much and maybe more all the time, because they're making mistakes I never made. They're doing things that I've never done. And I find that really exciting. So screen printing, for those of you who don't know what it is, what the heck is it? I'll show you. We all know probably the most familiar screen printer that we know out there is Andy Warhol. Now, this is the sort of epitome of what was possible in screen printing in the 1960s. Screen printing is a medium that comes from industry. So it was always used for printing words on boxes and for sale signs and that sort of thing, big, bold things. And Warhol was one of the first people to really start making use of it in terms of fine art. So taking this thing from the low end of the spectrum, something for industry, and elevating it into the world of high art, as well as he was with the imagery that he was using. Popular culture imagery and things, the whole pop art movement was about trying to elevate things that would be normally considered not worthy of being art into the realm of being art. And he was using a medium that wasn't considered to be art and trying to elevate it into the world of art making as well. Now, one of the things I'll point out really quickly here is that when Warhol was screen printing, you can see the turquoise around Marilyn, her hair, her face, the blue around her eyes, and the red in her lips. Those were really large, simple shapes. The only thing that has any kind of nuance is the photographic information that was printed in black that has a little bit of nuance in it. That really is the difference between what was possible then and what we can do now. We can print with much, much more fidelity and much more nuance than they were able to in the 1960s. And in part, it's because the ink that we use at UBCO is an ink that won't dry. It just won't dry until we forcibly run it through a machine, and the machine hits that ink with 5 days worth of ultraviolet light, and it's the ultraviolet light that dries the ink. So that allows us to print really, really fine details and not have to worry about those details clogging up in the screen while we're printing. And in a really dry environment like the Okanagan, any kind of water-based or oil-based ink that dries in the air tends to dry out really, really quickly. And suddenly, as you start printing, you start losing the lightest details. The ink that we use just doesn't have that problem. So this is a screen. Well, this is also me. Many years ago, this was during the 2003 fires while I was evacuated from my house, I did things in the studio because I lived in the studio for a couple of weeks, which I don't tell anybody I did that. I did it though. This is a screen. Basically, in our case, it's a aluminum metal frame stretched with a very fine mesh fabric. This is 300 mesh fabric, which means there's 150 lines of fabric running every inch in both directions. My math is terrible, but 150 times 150, that's how many openings there are in that screen. And that is the thing that we're able to capitalize on with this new ink that we use, is we can print things that are as tiny as those individual little openings. And I think that's pretty exciting and very new for screen printing. Now, the whole premise of screen printing, you can see that it's a sheer fabric. Ink could just go through that entire fabric, could just print a solid black ink through that fabric. So really, screen printing is about creating stencils, something that will prevent ink from going through parts of the fabric and allow it to go through other parts. This is about the most simple example I've got. There's me, and of course, whenever you are showing things, you have to point at it awkwardly. This is me with a stencil on the screen that just says "Rock the Chasmar." For those of you who don't know, the Chasmar was, maybe still is, a burger at Doc Willoughby's in town, and for a while there, it was the best bacon cheeseburger in the valley. And I used to rock the Chasmar 2 or 3 times a week. What we do, how we force ink through that stencil, is with a thing called a squeegee, and this wooden handled rubber-based squeegee blade that I'm holding is really not much different than what you would be squeegeeing your windshield off with on your car. It's not terribly different than wiper blades. It's much stiffer than that. It's much thicker than that, and but it's more or less the same thing. When we talk about ink for screen printing is roughly about the consistency of a good Balkan style yogurt. Quite often we say ink, people think liquid, and liquid would be terrible, be running all over the place. We want something that has a little bit of body. So when we put it down somewhere, or when we print it somewhere, it stays where we printed it, or it stays where we put it, rather than it running all over the place. So here I'm just spatulaing out some ink, dragging the squeegee behind the ink, pulling the ink along in front of me, forcing the ink through that stencil. You can do it many, many times. Once a stencil's made, you can print bazillions of these things. Well, maybe not bazillions, but hundreds at least. So there's that ink has gone through that stencil and nowhere else. And we have the thing for Rock the Chasmar. And then, of course, once again, you have to point at it awkwardly, because that's just what screen printers do. God, I'm so skinny in those days. And I had a red beard. That's depressing. Oh my God, I'm getting old. Okay, this is an example of one of my prints, and I thought I'd just whip through this really quickly so you can kind of get a sense of the number of layers of ink that I tend to print. That what we just saw was a single layer of black ink, and again in that 1960s sort of big blocky chunks of space. But this is a print called À l'Anglaise that I made a few years ago, and I have a breakdown of all the different stages. So I'll just whip through these really quickly. There's stage number 1. Now you can see immediately that this is black ink, yet the dots that create the image are very dense in her hair and very not dense in some of the background areas. Right, so I'm printing the same color ink, but I'm printing varying quantities or varying clusters of little teeny tiny little dots that will, when they get close together, they create dark areas, and when they get farther apart, they create light areas. So this was layer number 1. This is a color separation process that we go through. So it's printing cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which is the traditional way that any kind of magazine is printed, any kind of printed publication in color, any kind of signage that's in color tends to be printed with those 4 colors. Those 4 colors all blending together and overlapping one another should make a whole range of other colors. So there's layer number 1. There's layer number 2. There's the magenta information. And there's layer number 1 and number 2 together. So already we're seeing pinks, and we're seeing darker pink colors. We're seeing areas that are white and black and dark and light. There's layer number 3, the yellow layer, and there the 3 of them are together. Already we got reds, we got yellows, we got greens, well, not greens, we got pinks, we got blacks. And there's the cyan layer. Now, after this next thing up, I'm not hearing or seeing anybody, but normally when I do this, I expect some ooze. So I provided my own kind of ooze. So just hang on. There they are together. Ooh. There they are together. Look at that, 4 colors. And they just interweave and do amazing things together. It's just fascinating to me, and it still is. And I've been doing this for a really long time. And every time I pull a squeegee and lift the screen up to see what's underneath it, I'm just like, oh, that's awesome. Or, ooh. Now, this is what the computer told me to do. This is what the Photoshop version of color separating an image suggested was the thing to do. And it's pretty good. We've got a range of different colors. We've got pretty much everything that was needed to be there. I just don't think it's terribly rich. So I tend to go beyond that. I'm going to pass the ooh quickly. This was the next 4 layers of printing. You can see much redder red in some spots, a beige around the outside of the card because it didn't feel like it was separating from the white of the printing paper enough. I'm now putting color into the central post-it note and making the pink post-it note pinker. And that's what that looks like. Still not enough. There's 3 more. Making the green even greener in the post-it note, beefing up a couple of the blue blobs, and making that red not quite so fire truck red, and maybe something a little orangier. And that's what that looks like. Isn't it getting better? Yes, yes. Say yes. There's more. Beefing up certain parts of black, the pink again on the post-it note, and some specific accents of yellow in the blobs of paint. And again, making the green even greener, the reds even redder, and some blue, extra blues. And then adding some text to the post-it note, making it even greener still, and isolating and making that card, the edges of the card, a little bit darker than they were. And there we go. That's the final print. Ah. Now that's what the computer told me to do. That's what I did. Hopefully I've made it better, made it richer, and made it more nuanced and all that kind of stuff. But this is really not what a lot of conventional screen printing can do, because the subtlety of what we're doing, and this is a very small print. This is probably not much larger than the size this is on your computer screen, if you're watching this on the computer. But that's kind of the process that I go through to make prints. I tend to build things up over lots of layers of printing, lots of translucent layers of printing. I really want the color that I print to be built up, not just established in one shot. I want the reds to be resonant red, where the individual particles of pigment are distributed through a deep layer of ink, or many layers of ink that add up to a deep layer, rather than all being concentrated in one small thin layer of ink. And I think it makes for much more resonant color. That's certainly how I've evolved the work that I've been doing. And it's all about subtleties and those things that I think people notice when they get up really close to an image. A prof of mine years ago said something to the effect that you got to make work that will appeal to people differently from more than 20 feet away, less than 20 feet away, and less than 2 feet away. So no matter how they encounter your work, there's something specific that they can see in that. And I took that to heart. And I really think that hopefully this has a certain boldness, even though it's a very small image, that might appeal to people from a distance, but also then when they get in close, they can start seeing subtleties and nuances that are rich and subtle. Ooh, we had to end with another ooh. Sorry about that. Okay, back to Warhol. Obviously, Warhol was a huge influence on me growing up and throughout the 60s and 70s when I was in my formative years as a teenager. When I went to university, we really didn't work this way, but this was the kind of stuff that I always appreciated. In art history classes, I was always taking the pop art classes whenever I could, because that's the kind of stuff I liked looking at. When I went to grad school, this was one of the prints I made in grad school. This is my version of a tomato soup can. So this is my version of Warhol. This was a gestural hand-drawn lithograph. Lots of layers. Again, every color there is a different drawing on a stone, all piled up on one another. This just happened to be me finding a Campbell soup can in the back alley that had been run over by a car. And this was I kind of straightened it out a little bit, wiped off the tomato soup and tried to draw from it. I'm not sure how successful it was, but it was one of those moments where I think my work started becoming about pop art iconography, about mass-produced objects. And I was quite conscious of it at this point, whereas before, I think I wasn't very conscious of it. This is another lithograph from grad school, and I'm showing this one not because I think it's a particularly interesting image, although it is an O. Henry bar wrapper, and it's the 69.5 gram O. Henry bar wrapper, which is really exciting. But because it had this really interesting thing going on, this print was finished, but I didn't like it. It seemed too flat. So On the upper left side, all of that grid of dots were added well after the fact, and they were added back in screen printing. It was the moment where I was going, I actually prefer screen printing to lithography, just for myself, but that I'm starting to notice the dot pattern, the way things are printed commercially, and trying to make that grid of dots become part of the image. So this was kind of one of those moments in the development of my work where it was something big happened and I was, whoa, I'm not sure what that is, but I think it has something to do with dots. So then I became obsessed with dots. Everything I did ended up being grids of dots and layers of different tones and stuff. Now, this was when I was my first teaching job in the United States. I was teaching in Minnesota for 4 years. And I was walking to work one day, and sure enough, on the ground was what appeared to be some sort of disrupted picnic. And there was these couple of Oreo cookies left behind, half ground into the dirt. And it was a tragedy. I wept a little bit and then thought, well, I'm going to make Oreo cookie prints, which means I have to do some research, which is the best. So this was a grid of dots. These were 16 dots per square inch. So 4 dots each direction per square inch. And it was quite photographic. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. But what happens if the dots get bigger? Will the image become less photographic? Will people become more aware, viewers become more aware that this is about how images are printed commercially? We perceive so much of the world through photographic means, and photographs really are just configurations of dots. And certainly back in the 1980s, when this was happening, the resolution of a magazine photograph was quite coarse compared to what it is now. And I wanted to sort of think about, well, yeah, we do perceive reality through this very abstracted thing. And maybe my work could be about that. So I made another Oreo cookie print. Now this is 9 dots per square inch. Now I've added color, layers and layers of color, but still from a certain distance, this is clearly a picture of cookies. So I thought, well, let's make the dots bigger. So this is 1 dot per square inch, I think, or 4 dots per square inch. And that still seemed too photographic. So then I made really big dots. And I hate to say it, and if anyone's heard me talk before, you probably heard me say the same thing. I had an exhibition at the university in Minnesota where I was teaching. And the gallery was at the end of a very long hallway, and there was a glass wall to the gallery. So you could see some of the work hanging on the wall in the gallery when you walked into the building. You're about 50 to 75 yards away from it. And people would walk in the building and look down and go, oh, there's a picture of cookies down there. And it was this print. I'm like, how? So then out of frustration, trying to think, well, I'm trying to amplify the sense of these dots to make people really aware of how we perceive things. And so then I just made, but then I ended up making a picture of cookies. It just ended up being cookies. I was thwarted. But my interest in dots never ends. This was me in Halifax, or at Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia. One of the most picturesque photographic places in all of Canada. This is the picture I come away with. It's a dot. This was from St. John's, Newfoundland, one of my favorite things because it's lots of dots. Oh, I'm obsessed. I also get obsessed with things when I'm walking around. I collect things. I think the camera is a fantastic sketchbook. Always you find these beautiful little moments in the middle of a big, huge billboard of posted ads for things. And I've always really liked that kind of stuff. And sure enough, my work started becoming a little more like that. One of the things that I've done for many years too is as an art instructor at a university. Universities, not so much now, but back maybe 20 years ago, there were always hundreds and hundreds of National Geographic magazines kicking around because they're such fantastic resources for collage material. And I would love going through National Geographic magazines and getting really interested in an article and then finding that the page that ends the article is gone and there's something else there. And I love that juxtaposition. I love that I was expecting something and I got something else. So these were, this was the beginning of a small series of prints based on the accidental juxtaposition that happens when magazines kind of get torn up. And you hopefully create some kind of dialogue between one half and the other. I'm not sure there's any particularly deep and meaningful dialogue going on here, but it's also an image of 3 subway Santas, which you can't go wrong with that. Here's the second half of this. The dots are back. The dots were there too. I'm still just now sticking dots. I mean, obviously the image that I'm printing is made up of a series of dots, but then I'm also injecting these larger dots just because I was kind of trying to constantly refer back to the dot. Again, maybe not in a smart way, but that's how I tackled it then. Then this image, I thought, well, I'll make that dot into a character. That little dot's waiting to go home, just like the Santas are at the end of the hard-working Christmas day. More of those kinds of images. And along the way, during those three, and then this image more importantly than the others, or more significantly than the others, what I started noticing was I was interested in the photographs, in how one image played off of the other, how one spoke to the other or maybe contradicted the other, and added to a kind of new narrative. The narrative isn't really dictated by me, it's just I'm creating an opportunity for other people to figure out what the narrative is for them. What happened in making these collages that I was working from, so basically I would literally make this collage, put it on a computer scanner or photograph it, and then make it whatever size I wanted it to be, and then output color separations, and then just go through that same process that I did with the earlier piece that we saw all the different stages at. I'm slowly building an image up. What happened here, and what I became really acutely aware of, is that all this incidental bits of text, the things that just appeared through the tearing process, became the focus of most people's attention. They thought that those little bits of text were telling us something about how to read these two things. They weren't so much interested in the images and how the images related, but how the text told them how to interpret the images. And I found that kind of fascinating and a little bit disturbing, because I was really more interested in the imagery. But I also have to admit that I was really interested in printing the text parts. I loved printing that part. It was super easy to line up. I like that. And I like that it's so interpretable. So this image for me, in terms of thinking about how I created a narrative for it, we have these two kind of overweight white guys, obviously in some kind of a sauna or a bathhouse environment, which is something that maybe only rich people can do. And there's a picture above of people graduating. Clearly the most significant or the most noticeable one is a young Black man. And it felt to me like there was this kind of discussion about privilege and age and whiteness versus the promise of what's coming. And the words I want to be and going to and about my all seemed like they were, in fact, speaking to the way I was seeing that. And it was, again, purely incidental. I hadn't intended any of that at all. It just sort of happened. But I thought, well, maybe I could start using text in a more purposeful way. This is a very tiny little print, and this says there is nothing you can't do, which comes from a collected fortune cookie fortune that I've collected them all my life. I don't know why, because they mostly are dumb and they never come true. But well, maybe one of them came true. I did get one once that said you will never amount to anything, which maybe, who knows? But that was my favorite. That's my favorite fortune cookie I've ever received or ever come across. But there's nothing you can't do. This is a tiny little print. I chose to put the text into a block of text instead of spelling it out correctly. So you did have to spend a little more time trying to figure out how to read it. Once that's done, once you do read it, hopefully that little bit of extra time might make the words resonate a little more, because as we know, we get a fortune cookie and we rip it open, we look at it and we laugh and throw it on the table and never think about it again. And I was hoping that maybe these words might be something that we'd think about a little more, because simply by making it a little harder to read. The story that I have that goes along with this was a colleague of mine bought this to give to his wife for Valentine's Day, thinking that it was a very romantic, oh, honey, there's nothing you can't do. Isn't that nice? But she cannot read this. She can only read the rye snot high. She can't read, she can't see it. She still to this day, whenever I see her, which isn't very often, but when I do see her, she often says, I still can't read that damn print. It still says the rye snot high to me, which she didn't find was terribly romantic because it has the word snot in it, but you know, that's the way it goes. This is I'm showing this as part of a 6-print series of flashcards. These were based on mathematical flashcards that I found in a junk store, and I just made my own version with parts of words and words in them, because I like letters and I like text more than I like numbers. And I'm throwing this in because this was a piece that was in an exhibition that I had at the Culinary Art Gallery way back when, like 2003 or something. And the exhibition was called Emerta, based on this print. If you just read those letters in order, it says Emerta. And that's in a way the circle of life comes back, because this exhibition that's on currently now is called README. And this says README in scrambled letters. There's a whole series of those things. This one says image, but really it was just me trying to put letters together just because I think they look cool together. I think the G, the E, and the I looked really nice together. So I was trying to find two other letters that would help the G, the E, and the I turn into a word, and then making a whole series of these things. There are 6 in total, so when they are hanging on the wall together, there's also that tendency to want to play, that you see the big T and the E and the I from the next print, and you start trying to figure out how that could spell something new. And that became something that I was acutely aware of, that when you see text and you can't really read much in it, you might start playing a game with yourself to try to figure out what it's trying to say. I do that all the time. I hadn't thought of that when I made this series, but when they got up on the wall together, they actually did become this kind of interactive game where all the parts became tiles. That might become important later on. And by the way, there will be a quiz. Hopefully I'm not talking too fast or too weirdly. Okay, this is an admission that I have. It's terribly embarrassing, but when I was a little kid, I had no idea how the words at the top of the dictionary, the words that are there as a navigational aid, this is the first word on the page and this is the last word on the page, so you can find the word you're looking for. I didn't understand that's what it was for. Now I was maybe 7, so that's maybe it's understandable. But from that early age, I used to think those words at the top of the page were some kind of a weird story that didn't make any sense to me. And I've had that in the back of my head my entire life. So often when I'm going through dictionaries, I'm collecting those which are purely random combinations of words. My favorite of which is this one, utopian vacuum, not because I think it's saying something specific, but because I think it's opening up an avenue of thought. Hopefully it's suggesting that this could be meaningful, but I'm not pulling the trigger on what I think it is. And I'm trying to leave that up to the audience to sort out on their own. And I made a whole series of that kind of print with those found combinations of letters. So gutter snipe and halo was the last G word and the first H word on a given page. And I felt like those two things spoke to each other in a weird sort of way. And again, not a way that I want to dictate. I'm not trying to tell you what it is. I'm just trying to say, hey, look at this. You can play along with that. Now, while I was working on this body of work, someone came to me and said, oh, it's actually very much like what Roland Barthes said about the death of the author, that it's up to the reader, not the author, to interpret what's going on. That the reader is as much responsible for the content of a work than the author is, because the author's history really might not even be known to the reader. The reader needs to be able to bring their own history and experience to interpreting what's on the page. That's how I interpret it. So don't quote me on that. Don't call me I'm not a scholar on Roland Barthes at all. That's how I understand Barthes and that particular article. But it did become a kind of conscious thing, because I think it's interesting that naturally happens. I believe that to be true. I think when I'm looking at a work, I'm bringing my own experiences and my own interpretive abilities to that work, and that regardless of what the artist intended, I'm still there making my own decisions about what it's about. So I believe that to be true. But at that moment, I think I started being conscious of trying to create opportunities where that happened, that it wasn't just incidental, but it was purposeful. It was an opportunity to play for the viewer. This is still one of my favorites of that, Modern Nation Oath. It was the last M word, the first N word, and then when the O's started, it was the first O word on pages. Again, I think they just fit together beautifully. And I found them. I didn't have to invent it. It was a system. I'm looking through books, finding a little system for finding these things, and hopefully sometimes they work out. And I think that's been a major part of how I approach my work for many years, that I'm really not very good at inventing things. I'm really good at finding stuff, or maybe not really good at finding stuff. I'm okay at finding stuff, and hopefully I'm quite good at printing them once I do. Along the way, some of the other influences, I'm things that I notice. I mean, I'm always looking for things in the world that attract me. This was a brick wall in a back alley in downtown Toronto, and there's these wonderful little naked people. I love them. Her little vagina is exposed, his little penis is exposed. It's fantastic. It's like Adam and Eve. I've made a bunch of prints using these little characters because I just love them so much. And it's one of those things I felt like I just found this little beautiful gem of art making possibility just by looking around and paying attention to what's out there, which I think is what was happening in the pop art movement, just paying attention, and certainly back to the data, back to Duchamp and the ready-mades. It's about paying attention to the things that exist and thinking about them in a different way than we would normally think about them. This is one of my favorite little prints. It's a very tiny little print. And of course, I put Cecilia Puzzle and Peep with the little guy with a little erection. I think that's hilarious. Hilarious. It's not a pipe. Some other things that I just get obsessed with. I remember walking past this car park in downtown Toronto for years, just loving this pattern, and then realizing that it's the pattern that I had on my bookshelf with all my collection of National Geographic magazines. And so I started making prints like this. What I discovered here is that this, when you see all those titles and you see them on the wall, you start making connections between the different article titles from different magazines. And I think in a way, National Geographic is like Nostradamus or something. Once you get a collection of them together, it tells the history of everything that's happened and is going to happen. So there's all kinds of wonderful little references in there that I think we as viewers can start zeroing in on. And we'll focus on the things that seem meaningful to us, and then we'll focus on another one that seems meaningful, and hopefully make the mental leap to connecting the two. Made a bunch of those images. This one's quite funny because I do collect a lot of Post-it notes and things that are discarded. And a former student of mine, whose name is Sabina, collected things and used to send them to me every once in a while. And when I was first grading her back a long time ago, when I was on the computer for the first time, AppleWorks, which is what I was using to write before Microsoft Word became a thing, always changed the name Sabina into soybean. And so I was using these Post-it notes that had been made by Sabina/soybean, and one of the articles, there it is, you can see it there, one of the articles is soybeans. I think that's just funny and completely accidental. She was the one that pointed it out later on. She thought it was very purposeful, and I had just liked that magazine. This came back, my associate dean years ago, his wife was on a walk with their dog. The dog came back with that, heave a rock at me in its mouth. And she said, I've got to give that to Briar. And sure enough, a week later, it was in a print. I'm showing this in part because the things, that little bag of hearts and the temporarily out of service, temporary out of service, were found when I left the Kelowna Art Gallery the day after my previous show back in the early parts of the 2000s happened. I walked out of the gallery, found them on the road, brought them home, put them on a table with a bunch of other things, and years later, they just happened to be on top of this National Geographic magazine. And I was like, "Ooh, that's kind of nice. I like it." Now, I did then go and erase part of the magazine using solvent to isolate that crazy zebra head, freaking out zebra. But I think that somehow there's a story between temporarily out of service, those hearts, and that crazed zebra. What that story is completely up to you. Text has become much more important, and I think I'm trying to be, well, I fell in love with a poet. I fell in love with a radical feminist poet, and I don't know if she's here tonight listening or not, but if she is, well, way to go, Sarah. And I think the things that I started writing and things that I started putting onto work started becoming a little more politically aware and maybe a little more open to a political or a social interpretation. It wasn't just so much about making people laugh, but now trying to say something. And I do think that this image was one of the first ones where the socio-political started becoming a little more dominant in the work. So deserve what you want over top of, I can't remember what it says underneath there. Yeah, where do you think you are? And then on top of a magazine that has an American flag in it, not trying to pick on the States, but it seemed like those three things all kind of worked together and started becoming a bit more politically astute. Nike's wonderful phrase, just turned around a little bit, do it just. I've always collected junk, weird junk, little tiny slate chalkboards are amongst them. I have a huge collection of them, love them. And I started playing with chalk and then working on the computer on top of that to try to create something that felt like a chalkboard. There's another chalkboard one. It will be clear soon, we hope. What's underneath there, not so clear. And I can't even remember what it says. But I think you can, and it's probably a little harder on a computer screen. This print is roughly 30 by 40 inches, so it's 40 inches tall, 30 inches wide roughly. And I think when it's hanging on the wall, you can decipher what's underneath. And for me, it's still going back to that original National Geographic thing where half an image and half an image kind of get together and talk to each other. And I think that these phrases, and I'm sorry to say that I can't remember what the bottom layer says, are meant to strike a bit of a conversation with one another and maybe propose different takes on the same thing, or maybe dramatically different perspectives on something, and leave it up to the viewer to wade through. Chalkboard image, I just like this one, the end. I always loved the thing at the end of movies. It's just like, oh, it's so iconic. And so few movies have the end anymore, which is too bad. Okay, this is one of my favorite accidents. I went looking a few years ago for comic books that I had when I was a kid, because I was thinking, well, I've grown up a lot. My mind is different now. Maybe I would interpret them quite differently. So I thought, well, if I can get those comic books back, because of course my mom threw them out, which most moms do, which is not a bad thing. Way to go, moms. But I thought if I could get them back, I could get some of them back. I'd think about them differently, and maybe that could spawn some work. So I went looking for comic books that I had when I was a kid and could not find any. Couldn't find any, but I did find on eBay 2 comic books that were tied together. You couldn't buy one without the other. There was this Young Love comic, and there was the Batman comic. I really only wanted the Batman comic. I didn't really know. I'd never even heard of Young Love before. It seemed like, oh, that's going to be stupid. But I wanted the Batman comic enough that I thought, well, I'll get both. When they both arrive, I'll just throw the Young Love one away, and I'll be working with the Batman one. But when they arrived, I realized that the text that was actually on the cover of Young Love made way more sense on top of Batman. And the text that was on Batman made way more sense on the Young Love. Well, maybe not made more sense, but it certainly seemed more amusing to me. So Batman's saying, I followed him into a coffee shop the way a starved kitten follows the scent of milk. Robin's is a little harder to see. If I look up at him, he'll see that I've fallen in love with him at first sight. That's awesome. Young Love's amazing. It's way better dialogue than Batman, because Batman's dialogue was, what in the world is wrong with Batman? I was too upset to know. But it also made kind of a weird sense with this teary-eyed young lady on this thing. So that's me just looking for fantastic little accidents that spark an interest in me. And in a way, you can hopefully see that I jump around a lot in my work. I jump from chalkboards to National Geographic magazines to comic books to just text things that are on pages. And I kind of give myself leave to do that, because I'm always looking around and looking for things that interest me, or catch my attention, or amuse me, or seem somehow poignant. It's another National Geographic magazine using the same basic cover that I used before with the American flag and whitewash privilege. Underneath that says all men are created equal. The interesting thing with this was, and this was somewhat purposeful, that the spines, these particular magazines were chosen so that we have American Indians, we have Indians and other things that also add into the conversation between the image, the 2 bits of text, and the spine. The text on the spines are all meant to interweave and provide something to think about. This, I have to say, is one of my favorite prints in the last number of years, in a way, because it feels like it pictorializes the crazy barrage of stuff that I feel is always being projected at me. It says a smatter of fact, which obviously playing off the term a matter of fact, also, which I think conjures up the idea of misinformation, post-truth, all those things, a smatter of fact. but it plays with it in a different way. And then underneath that, it says, hear me, trust me, believe me, all mashed together on this chalkboard to the point where you kind of have a hard time reading it, and you kind of have a hard time making sense of it. And that to me is sort of epitomizing the way I feel about a lot of what is barraged at us every day. Same thing with the phrase post-truth. This background, it says, you will benefit if you cooperate. These were all made not too long after the first Justin Trudeau government was elected, and not too long after the Donald Trump era started in the US. And all these things were becoming this sort of political unrest in the sense of things being blatant lies coming at us, and it all sort of spawned these works. These are just the backs of old etching plates that I literally hammer letters into, and then use a camera or a scanner to scan them and break them down into images. And again, these are fairly large. There's roughly in the 30 by 40 inch range. This is a piece that I've done many, many versions of. These are all words from my artist statement. And I broke them up into fairly large scale fridge magnet poetry. So this thing I think is 8 feet high by 16 feet long. And so you can imagine how large the individual text magnets are. And then the audience can just play and move them around and say whatever they want me to say using my words. And I think that's kind of fun. And I've done very, very different versions of it, which you'll see in a little bit of this same thing. At the opening for that exhibition, that was an exhibition in the Vernon Gallery, because we were allowed to have openings in those days. Before this was pre-COVID, pre the sickness. The first 80 people that showed up got words from my artist statement and on T-shirts, and I kind of love that as a conceptual piece, that my artist statement in little fragmented sections is still floating around Kelowna, being worn at different times and in different places by different people. So again, my words are out there for other people to do whatever they want with them, which I kind of like. This is still in that exhibition there, and I started playing with a neon, which was great fun to play with. I wish I could do it myself, but there's a place in Oliver that makes neon still. And for me, the term "more lies to come" is just fantastic, because there's no single way to read that. More lies to come seems really optimistic, and then more lying is coming isn't so optimistic. And I love that duality. And depending on what day of the week what day it is and what mood I'm in, I will read this as being very pessimistic or very optimistic. There is nothing you can't do, but the apostrophe T flicks on and off, as any good damaged neon should do. So there's nothing you can do, and there's nothing you can't do. Make up your mind whichever one you think is the most important. I love this little picture. It's that kid's head right in front of the T. Again, back to back to Fortune Cookie Fortunes that I've been collecting and layering them on top of each other. And this was really, I have to say, as much a challenge to see, could I print the subtlety of layers of translucent paper and make them feel like actual pieces of translucent paper stacked on top of each other, given the fact that we can print this really incredibly fine detail. So this to me was as much a challenge of printing as it was of content. However, I think these things all piled up on top of each other, will you make a change for a better in life? Wasn't supposed to say in life, but there it is. And then underneath, there's all kinds of other things. And you can spend quite a long time kind of sorting out the different layers of what's back there. More prints like that. This was around the beginning of the pandemic, and we were starting to stop. Everything was starting to stop. And it seemed like every day I woke up and listened to CBC when I was laying in bed, and it was all about all the things we needed to do to start to stop. And one day, Bro Justin was very angry, and he was reading us the riot act on the radio in the morning, telling us that we weren't doing what we should be doing. And so I thought riot act made some kind of sense to me. Quite often idiosyncratic things. I mean, getting more and more into wood type and lead type, And oh my God, being a thing, of course, in type land, it would be backwards. And I had this set up to print, and I dropped a piece of paper on it with a drop of water by accident, and the type started bleeding through the paper. And I thought, well, that's actually way more interesting than if it was printed. So it became a piece. And again, this is all printed, so those layers of mulberry paper are illusions. They're not really real. It's a piece that was made last summer or 2 summers ago for a show in Poland. No, I guess it was made last summer around this time. Again, fridge magnet poetry type thing. The gallery in Poland didn't want steel put on the walls, so I had to make shelves for these things to sit on. But these were, this text isn't my artist statement anymore. This was a number of articles that I cut up about Black Lives Matter. And again, you can recreate them, you can move them around, you can make it say different things. You could say things even, I suppose, that contradict the idea of Black Lives Matter, but it still has at its essence I hope the meaning behind that movement and that way of thinking that I think we need to get to. There's a number of different iterations of that with different words being used. This is the exhibition at the Kelowna Art Gallery. So if you haven't seen it yet, this is more or less what it looks like, but go see it anyway if you haven't seen it yet. Good grief, it's way better live than it is on a computer screen. The version, the one piece that was new, this was all work from that the gallery has in their collection. And the one piece that was new was this piece on the table, which is a word game that was invented a few years ago by 2 of our technicians and me, Don Lyons and Mona Butts. And I had minor input into how it all evolved. And it was a game that was sat outside the printmaking studio, and we could just move around and play and make words and make sentences and say things all day long. And we literally have thousands and thousands of things that people have written down. And it's just a really fun game, but it's a game that kind of begs participation. I think you can't really look at that and not want to rearrange them and say something for yourself, even if it's nasty or short, and you just escape from the gallery thinking, I've left my work. So there's another view and other works on the other wall. And that's all, folks. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I have to say, that's very weird talking to a blank screen. But thank you. You nodded very nicely, Victoria. I appreciate that. It was nice. I saw the nodding. Sometimes it made me feel much better.
Trying to be here for you, trying to have some sort of a presence.
Yeah, so weird. It's I have to say that trying to teach art over the last couple of years, when often we have to do some of it online, is so strange, and it's antithetical to what it is. So in 10 years time, we're going to look back on this and we're going to be making art about how we weren't able to make art together. So I think it'll be interesting times ahead. But thank you so much, Briar. Really appreciate it. I think I came in time too. I think I did it.
Perfect. It's like you've done this a million times.
Well, I was slamming back a Jolt Cola all day, so I was ready to talk fast.
You're ready. All right. No, that was fantastic. Thanks for sharing all that information. Everybody, it is now time for your favorite portion of the evening, our Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, pop them into the chat bar. I see a lot of things coming up already. Thank you, thank you. But yes, very entertaining talk. I was thoroughly engaged the whole time.
Well, that's good. That's good.
All right. So we did have one question come in while you were speaking earlier. So Kyle was asking, does Briar miss painting with oils, or sorry, printing with oils? And do you find that there's a difference in color?
There's a minor difference in color. I think that oil-based inks were a little more resonant, I think the UV-based ink, which is water cleanup, which is nice, and that's one of the reasons we went to it. So we're not putting horrible things down into the environment. It's a little pastier, I think, and so not quite as resonant. But I have to say, this past Christmas, I printed the tiles, in the exhibition with oil-based ink, and I thought I was going to die. The smell was so awful. I literally my head was spinning. I wasn't really sure what I was doing. I thought I was going to pass out a couple times. So that part I don't miss at all. The UV inks that we have now do smell a little bit. They have an odor. It's not a toxic odor, and it's not an odor that's eating away your brain. But it's an odor. It smells a little like plastic, and so I can live with that. Whereas the oil-based inks were just, when I pulled them out again, I could not believe that was the environment that I taught in for 20 years.
Oh,
that's
yeah.
maybe why I'm the way I am now.
I work with oil paints in my small home studio, so can't wait to.
Well, the thing with screen printing, when you're printing with oil-based things, is that not only do you have a single image that's covered with oil that off gases as it dries, but you have an addition of them.
That's
so
right.
You might have 10 or 15 pieces of paper that have huge puddles of oil on them, and all that's off gassing in a matter of 20 minutes. And it puts a lot of toxins in the air. Like oil paint might off gas for days and days and days as it's drying. So it's much more gradual. Whereas in oil-based screen printing, it happens all at once, and it happens from many, many pieces of paper. It's nasty.
Wow.
So I'm glad we moved away from that. I'm glad we moved to something that's a little more environmentally friendly, and the little subtle differences in color quality and the resonance of color it's acceptable to me. Because I work in color separation too, everything's about translucency. So it's always letting the white of the paper through to give the color resonance and luminosity. So it's not too bad.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the question, Kyle. That was a good one. So we have lots of other comments as well. Thank you. Printing is a new topic to me. So Sandy, is saying it's a new topic for me. I learned a lot about the process and your creativity. Marvelous talk. We've got one here for
people are laughing, which is good. That's great.
Yes, that's great.
And I have to say, I see a note here towards the bottom of the list so far from Mark Bovey. Mark Bovey is one of the professors and one of my colleagues who teaches at NASCAD U in Halifax. And Mark was I think he was one that coined the phrase "rock the chasmar." And it was him that we got this obsession, and I think he probably had more chasmars than I did the year he was teaching here. But it's fantastic. It's fantastic burger, or it was. I don't know if it still is.
Oh, it's amazing. Well, there's one back up here from Ari. Thanks for the artist talk, Briar. I was wondering if you have advice for beginning to integrate text into work for someone who finds inventing interesting words and writing hard. I like text, but I struggle to think of what to say. Any ideas or advice?
Well, I do have some advice and I have some ideas. I think one of the most interesting ways to use text is to just find it. If you can't find something that's interesting or open-ended, make it so by deploying what the Dadaists did. And back in the day, Tristan Tzara wrote a little manifesto about how to write a Dada poem. And I don't know it verbatim, but I'm paraphrasing, but it's more or less it. Find an article in a newspaper, roughly the length you want your new poem to be, cut all the words out individually, put them in a bag, pull them out one by one, and write them down in the new order. And in doing that, of course, not everything's going to be interesting. In fact, quite often it sucks. It just doesn't make any sense at all. But occasionally that accidental juxtaposition of words creates something new and incredibly interesting and poignant. That would be the way I would tackle wanting to use text and not knowing what to say, is just find something and then rearrange it and see if it says something in a way that you didn't expect, or that touches on a topic or something that you're interested in. Then it's not really you coming to invent the words, it's them being kind of finding you in a way. That'd be my best suggestion to get started doing that stuff. And Tzara makes me sound really smart.
Nope, exactly. No, that's a really good suggestion. I struggle with the same thing. You always feel like you're trying to dream up these eloquent sounding words and put them together, and it's like, just find them or let them find you. makes it a lot easier.
I do have a dumb story, but actually when I was in Halifax at NASCAD doing a residency there, Mark Bovey and I were driving around in the car, and the curator or one of the curators at the Nova Scotia Art Gallery was in the back, and she was reading signs in windows as we were going along, and I couldn't really hear her very well. And I swear to God, she said at one point, "cage-free poetry." And the fact that my partner's a poet made me think, cage-free poetry, that's just awesome. I'm not sure what uncaged poetry is all about compared to caged poetry, but I made a print using that text. And of course, later on, I was walking past that same district and saw of course, it said cage-free poultry, not cage-free poetry. But what I heard was way more interesting than cage-free poultry. So again, thank you for that drive, Mark. We went to get a really good burger in Halifax too at that time, I think.
Oh, there's a really good peanut butter and jelly burger in Halifax, just FYI. I'll let you know. Okay, so lots of questions rolling in. All right, let's see. I've got Maria. When sourcing things like magazines and comic books, how do you make the decision to accept an object as it is, or to just take away the information you want? Is there a point where you think you've removed too much of the original object or gone too far?
Yes, good question. That's a great question. I don't know that there's any really easy answer. I mean, you can see if I tilt my camera up a little bit, I've got National Geographic magazines all over the place. Wherever I go, they're there. And quite often I go to use bookstores that have multiples of everything. So if I get an idea, if I try something and it doesn't work out very well, I've got another copy of that magazine that I can then try to do it better. But mostly I think for me, I've just been trying to do things that are kind of accidental. So if they don't really work out the way I expected them to, chances are that's okay. Sometimes when I do something and it goes, oh, that's exactly what I expected, it ends up being the most boring print in the end. So quite often it's the thing that maybe I don't really love the way it looks, it evolves into being the thing that I like to look at than not. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question there, but there is no single way to do things or learning how to take away things or knowing what to do. It's just being somewhat inspired by something and then trying something out and see what happens. And Photoshop is a fantastic tool now because you can just put things on top of things and very quickly. And while I'm certainly not adept at Photoshop, I'm getting that way because I just play with it all the time. It's a great sketchbook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I hope
no,
I
that's
answered your question. If not,
I think so. No, they said that seems like it. Another interesting question here from Sanette. They say, wonderful to see such inspirational screen printing, so engaging. As a screen printer myself, I wonder if it is becoming a dying art form. What do you think?
Ooh. No,
loaded question. I hope not.
I think there's actually kind of a resurgence of it. It seems when I've gone to print the Southern Graphics Council print conference in the States, it happens every year, although not the last couple of years. It seems that screen printing is having a kind of bit of a rebirth. And I think the DIY movement has made this quite accessible printmaking medium a little more prominent somehow. Because in the grand scheme of printmaking, lino cut, you can do that on your kitchen table, but you can also screen print on your kitchen table if you really needed to. You can't really do litho that well that way, and you certainly can't make etching that well that way. So I think that screen printing is actually kind of blossoming again because there's more possibilities. And of course, the ink technologies. Years ago, the only water-based ink that was on the market, it seemed, was made by Speedball, and even Speedball's water-based ink has gotten so much better in the last couple of years because people are using it. I don't think they'd be spending time developing that technology if it wasn't being used. So hopefully it's not a dying thing. I think it fell out of favor because litho etching and other media could get much finer details, and certainly that's why one of the reasons we went to the UV ink that we use, so we could kind of match the fidelity and the subtlety that those other media could create, but through screen printing. And screen printing is, by comparison, incredibly fast. If you've got 4 screens, you could print 4 colors in a day. In fact, that print that I showed at the beginning of the blobs of paint and stuff, That print all happened, all 21 layers of that happened in one day.
Oh, wow.
Because I had 21 screens ready, and I just came in and started printing, and it was great fun to do that really fast. Because normally it takes a lot longer and you work in stages more.
Yeah, like you mentioned with the DIY culture, I'm thinking about fashion and textiles and, you know, screen printing onto clothing.
Yeah.
And it seems there's also a resurgence in making your own clothing and recycling fashion, you know, thrifting, all that sort of stuff. So it could go well together. Which,
yeah. Well, and certainly in a lot of other cultures, non-Western cultures, that printing onto fabrics and onto silks and things like that is a tradition that's been going on for probably hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And I think that's gradually working its way into high-end fashion now. My partner often sees fantastic dresses or shirts that are these are screen printed, and they're incredibly intricate and detailed. And so hopefully that screen printing just seems to be able to weasel its way into all kinds of other things, and hopefully it'll be strong forever.
It seems like it. All right, so just a couple more questions here. Anne is asking, where do you store all of these like slates and magazines and printing plates? Where do you put all this stuff?
Well, partly here in my crazed office, but we bought a very big house, and we have an entire basement that is just pretty much me. My partner's been extremely accommodating and said, that's your space down there. And it's getting full. So I've got a lot of stuff. But I mean, most of the things that I collect, they tend to be magazines, or they tend to be scraps of paper off the street. So they're not really hugely bulky things. I mean, if I was collecting like fire hydrants, that would be a real problem. But I'm not doing that, thank God. Although I did collect typewriters for a while. I think it was up to about 15 typewriters, and they started taking up a lot of space.
Yeah, they're heavy.
And they're heavy. So
yeah.
Right now, my current obsession is lead type, so lead and wood type. So I'm collecting that, and that takes up a lot of space, and it's heavy. But
hard to come by. I've also looked for like the lead typeface myself, and it's a niche market.
Yes, there is a guy on Vancouver Island in Shirley, BC, that is casting some type now, and he's kind of the West Coast guy that is all press related stuff. We just bought a press for the school from him, and I bought one for my house. So, and he casts some type, and he gets type. He collects things and then sells it and stuff. It's quite great.
Well, it's amazing. All right, well, we'll finish off with Katrina's question. Do you have a taste for British tea, or do you collect packaging for text there too?
I do have a taste for British tea. I did set some things up before we started just to make sure things were, I was doing my plugging. PG Tips is one of my favorite teas, but also Yorkshire tea is it suits the water at my house more than any other tea. So I do have a taste for those things, but I also like the boxes.
Excellent. All right, well, we'll end off there with our questions. Thank you so much, Briar, for answering all of our inquiries, and thank you for the really engaging and fun talk that you were able to provide us with this evening. A quick plug before I let everyone go. We will be doing a Printmakers panel discussion on March 31st. So if you're interested in all things printmaking, be sure to join us then. It'll be at 6 o'clock on Zoom as well. Yeah, and Briar, if you have any closing statements.
We also have, for people that are in the area, we're also doing an open house, and I can't remember what the date is for that, but it's in
April 2nd.
Yeah, so it's Saturday the 2nd.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's a sign up thing because we can't have too many people in the print studio here. But if you're interested in seeing what lithography is and etching is and lino cut printing is and screen printing, you can certainly come to the studio, and I'll have me doing some screen printing and some students doing some other things. And we'll have a couple of rounds of people coming through to see those things. And I'm also just going to acknowledge I see a lot of people that I know in the group that have come to the talk. I really appreciate it. Back to roommates and from university. So Tracy Berry, thank you for coming. That's awesome. I'm glad you still have that print.
That's amazing. Yes, cool. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. And thanks again, Briar. And we'll see you all again soon, hopefully. Have a great night.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.